Hatchet Chapter 7. Mother! He screamed it and could not be sure if the scream had awakened him or the pain in his stomach. The whole abdomen was torn with great rolling jolts of pain, pain that doubled him in the darkness of the little shelter, put him over and face down in the sand to moan again, "Mother, mother, mother." Never anything like this, never. If it was as if all the berries, all the pits had exploded in the center of him, ripped and torn at him. He crawled out the doorway and was sick in the sand, and then crawled still further and was sick again, vomiting with terrible diarrhea all for over an hour. For over a year, he thought, until it was last empty, drained of all strength. He crawled back into the shelter and felt it again in the sand, but could not sleep at first, couldn't do anything except lie there, and his mind decided to bring up the memory again. In the mall, every detail, his mother sitting in the station wagon with the man, and she had leaned across and kissed the man with the short blonde hair. It was not a friendly peck, but a kiss where she turned her head over at an angle and put her mouth against the mouth of the blonde man, who was not his father, and kissed mouth to mouth, and then brought her hand up to touch his cheek, his forehead, while they were kissing, and Brian saw this thing that his mother did with the blonde man, saw the kiss that became the secret, and his father still did not know about it. No, at all. The memory was so real that he could feel the heat in the mall that day, could remember the worry that Terry would turn and see his mother, could remember the worry and the shame of it, and then the memory faded and he slept again, awake. For a second, perhaps two, he did not know where he was, and was still in his sleep somewhere. Then he saw the sun streaming in the open doorway of the shelter, heard the close, the vicious whine of the mosquitoes, and knew. He brushed his face, completely welted now with 2 days of bites, completely covered with lumps and bites. He was surprised to find the swelling on his forehead had gone down a great deal. It was almost gone. The smell was awful, and he couldn't place it. Then he saw the small pile of berries at the back of the shelter, and remembered the night and being sick. Too many of them, he said. Too many gut cherries. He crawled out of the shelter and found where he had messed the sand. He used sticks and cleaned it the best he could, and covered the sand, and went down to the lake to wash his hands and get a drink. It was still very early, only just past dawn, and the water was so calm he could see his reflection. It frightened him. The face was cut and bleeding, swollen and lumpy. His hair was all matted on the forehead. A cut had healed, but left a hair stuck with blood and scab. Left his hair stuck with blood and scab. His eyes were slits in the bites, and he was somehow covered with dirt. He slapped the water with his hands to destroy the mirror. Ugh, he thought. Very, very ugly. And he was at that moment almost overcome with self-pity. He was dirty and starving and bitten and hurt and lonely and ugly and afraid, and so completely miserable. It was like being in a pit, a deep pit with no way out. He sat back on the bank and fought crying, then let it come, and cried perhaps 3 or 4 minutes. Long tears, self-pity tears, wasted tears. He stood, went back to the water, and then took small drinks. As soon as the cold water hit his stomach, he felt his hunger sharpen, as it had before, and he stood and held his abdomen until hunger cramps receded. He had to eat. He was weak down with the hunger. He had to eat. Back in the shelter, the berries lay in a pile where he had dumped them when he grabbed his windbreaker. Gut cherries, he called them in his mind now, and he thought of eating some of them. Not such a crazy amount as he had, which he felt brought the sickness in the night, but just enough to stave off hunger a bit. He crawled into the shelter. Some flies were on the berries, and he brushed them off. He selected only the berries that were solidly ripe, not the light red ones, but the berries that were a dark maroon red to black and swollen in ripeness. When he had a small handful of them, he went back down to the lake, washed them in the water. Small fish scattered away when he splashed the water up, and he wished that he had a fishing line and hook. Then he ate them carefully, spitting out the pits. They were still tart, but had a sweetness to them, though they seemed to make his lips a bit numb. When he was finished, he was still hungry, but the edge was gone, and his legs didn't feel as weak as they had. He then went back to the shelter. It took him about half an hour to go through the rest of the berries and sort them out, putting all the ripe ones in a pile and on some leaves, the rest on another pile. When he was done, he covered the 2 piles with grass and tore from the lake shore. When he was done, he covered the 2 piles with grass he tore from the lake shore to keep the flies out, and went back outside. They were awful berries, those gut cherries, he thought. But there was food out there, food of some kind, and he could eat a bit more later tonight if he had to. For now, he had a full day ahead of him. He looked at the sky through the trees, and saw that while there were clouds, they were scattered and did not seem to hold rain. There was a light breeze, and that seemed to keep the mosquitoes down, he thought, looking up along the lake shore. If there was one kind of berry, let me try that whole sentence again. Okay. There was a light breeze, and that seemed to keep the mosquitoes down, he thought, looking up along the lake shore. If there was one kind of berries, there should be other kinds, sweeter kinds. If he kept the lake in his sights, as he had done yesterday, he should be all right. Should be able to find home again. And it stopped him. He actually thought it this time. Home. 3 days. No, 2, 3. Yes, this was the 3rd day, and he thought of the shelter. As home. He turned and looked at it, studied the crude work. The brush made a fair wall, not watertight, but it cut most of the wind off. He hadn't done so badly at that. Maybe it wasn't much there, but also maybe it was all he had for a home. All right, he thought, so I'll call it home. He turned back and set off the side of the lake, heading for the gut cherry bushes, the windbreaker in his hand. Things were bad, he thought, but maybe not that bad. He could find some better berries. When he came to the gut cherry bushes, he paused. The branches were empty of birds and still had many berries, and some of those had been merely red yesterday and were now a dark maroon to black, much riper. He should stay and pick them to save them. But the explosion of the night was still much in his memory, and he decided to go on. Gut cherries were food, but tricky to eat. He needed something better. Another 100 yards of the shore, there was a place where the wind had torn the path. These must be some fierce winds, he thought, to tear places like this, as they had the path he had found with the plane when he crashed. Here the trees were not all the way down, but twisted and snapped off halfway up from the ground, so their tops were all down and rotted and gone, leaving the snags poking into the sky like broken teeth. It made for tons of dead and dry wood, and he wished once more that he could get a fire going. It also made a kind of clearing. With the tops of the trees gone, the sun could get down to the ground, and it was filled with the small thorny bushes that were covered with berries. Raspberries. These he knew because they were some raspberry bushes in the park that he and Terry were always picking and eating them when they biked past. These berries were full and ripe, and he tasted one and found it sweet, with none of the problems of the gut cherries. Although he did not Although they did not grow in clusters, there were many of them, and they were easy to pick. Brian smiled and started eating. Sweet, juicy, thought. Oh, they were sweet, with just a little tang. And he picked and ate, and thought that he had never tasted anything so good. Soon, as before, his stomach was full, but he had some sense, and he did not gorge or cram more down. Instead, he picked some more, putting them in his windbreaker, feeling the morning sun on his back, and thinking he was rich now with food, just rich. And he heard some noise to his rear, a slight noise, and turned and saw the bear. He could do nothing, think nothing. His tongue, stained with berry juice, stuck to the roof of his mouth. He stared at the bear. It was black, with cinnamon-colored nose, not 20 feet from him. Big, no, huge. It was all with fur. It was all black fur and huge. He had seen one in a zoo in the city once, a black bear, but it had come from India or somewhere. This one was wild, much bigger than the one in the zoo, and right there. The sun caught the end of the hairs along its back, shining black and silky. The bear stood on its hind legs, half up, and studied Brian, just studied him, then lowered itself and moved slowly to the left, eating berries as it rolled along, wuffing and delicately using its mouth to lift each berry from the stem, and in seconds it was gone. And Brian had still not moved. His tongue was stuck to the top of his mouth, the tip half out. His eyes were wide, and his hands were reaching for a berry. Then he made a sound, a low "mmm." It made no sense. It was just a sound of fear, of disbelief that something that large could have come so close to him without his knowing. It just walked up to him, and it could have eaten him, and he could have done nothing. And when the sound was half done, a thing happened to his legs, a thing that he had nothing to do with, and they were running the opposite direction from the bear and back towards the shelter. He would have run all the way in panic, but after he'd gone perhaps 50 yards, his brain took over and slowed and finally stopped him. If that bear had wanted to, his brain said, he would have taken you. It is something to understand, he thought, not something to run away from. The bear was eating berries, not people. The bear had made no move to hurt you, to threaten you. It stood to see you better, study you, and then went on its way eating berries. It was a big bear, but it did not want you, did not want to cause you harm, and that is the thing to understand here. He turned and looked back to the stand of raspberries. The bear was gone. The birds were singing. He saw nothing that could hurt him. There was no danger here that he could feel. In the city at night, there was sometimes danger. You could not be in the park at night after dark because of the danger. But here, the bear looked at him and had moved on. And this filled his thoughts. The berries were so good, so sweet and rich, and his body was so empty. And the bear had almost indicated that it didn't mind sharing. He had just walked from him. And the berries were so good. And he thought, finally, if he did go back and get the berries, he would have to eat the gut cherries again tonight. If he did not go back and get the berries, he would have to eat the gut cherries tonight. That convinced him, and he walked slowly back to the raspberry patch and continued picking for an entire morning, although with great caution, and once when a squirrel rustled some pine needles at the base of a tree, he nearly jumped out of his skin. About noon, the sun was straight overhead. The clouds began to thicken and look dark. In moments, it started to rain, and he took whatever he had picked and trotted back to the shelter. He had probably eaten 2 pounds of raspberry and had another 3 pounds in his jacket, rolled in a pouch. He made it to the shelter just as the clouds completely opened and the rain poured down from the sky. Soon the sand outside was drenched, and there were rivulets running down to the lake, but inside he was dry and snug. He started to put the picked berries back in the sorted pile with the gut cherries, and he noticed that the raspberries were seeping through his jacket. They were softer than the gut cherries, and apparently were being crushed a bit with their own weight. When he had held the jacket up and looked beneath it, he saw a stream of red liquid, and put his finger in it and found it to be sweet and tangy, like pop without fizz. He grinned and lay back on the sand, holding the bag up over his face and letting the seepage drip into his mouth. Outside the rain poured down, but Brian lay back drinking the syrup from the berries, dry and plain, the berries dry and with the pain almost gone, the stiffness almost gone, his belly nearly full, and a good taste in his mouth. For the first time since the crash, he was not thinking of himself, of his own life. Brian was wondering if the bear had been surprised as he was to find another being in the berries. Later in the afternoon, as the evening came down, he went to the lake and washed the sticky berry juice from his face and hands, and went back to prepare for the night. While he had accepted and understood that the bear did not want to hurt him, it was still much in his thoughts, and in the darkness came into the shelter. He took the hatchet out of his belt and put it by his head, his hand on the handle. As the day caught up with him, and he slept.